Okay, so how to save the golden goose. All right.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Carrie Heinzel. I am a financial professional. I am a CDFA. Let's see, I am very much a neutral. Everything I do is about being that wonderful neutral person, and I consider myself a settlement expert. I don't always go and say I'm a financial expert. I think I'm a settlement expert. I am collaborative trained, level 1 and 2, which I love, and member of the Law Society of Ontario, which is a little bit different for most financial people. We're not usually members of the Law Society. I'm also obviously a member of the IDFA. I'm on the board of directors for the York Collaborative Group, and I am an active member for York Collaborative, Durham Collaborative, Kawartha Collaborative, and Toronto Collaborative groups.
Right.
So just a couple.
Excellent.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jason Kwiatkowski. I'm also a financial professional, but I'm a specialist in business valuation. So I have a business valuation designation in Canada, the CBV, Chartered Business Valuator. I'm collaboratively trained as well, back in 2012. So I've been involved in collaborative files for a number of years. And I get called into situations when there is a business involved or a number of businesses involved, and the parties need my expertise to help explain to them and go through perhaps what the value of the business is for equalization, or what the business owner's income is for support purposes. So I have a very specialized role in the collaborative process.
I'm Russell Alexander. I practice in Southern Ontario. I've been doing divorces for 20 years, focusing more now on private small businesses going through divorce. It's an area that we're really trying to develop more. I have a hybrid practice, which means I still go to court. I prefer not to, so everybody comes into the firm. We encourage their spouse to get a collaborative lawyer. Sometimes they don't, so I'll still continue on with that file in court. It's certainly not my preference. We've had a lot of files recently that come to our office that are already in court, and there's a couple examples we're going to talk about today. And we've pulled them out of the court system and resolved it collaboratively. Just because the financial impact on the family-run business was going to be too great, having a judge come up with a solution pursuant to our statute. So that's who I am. We have some questions that we've already answered, so that's good. You want to go to the next slide?
One of the things that, like Russell mentioned, anytime you have a question anywhere throughout the presentation, don't hesitate. We want to get good dialogue going for everybody as well, so don't hesitate on that.
Or if any situation comes to mind that you want to share, right, just to talk about the issue and share some examples, we're happy to do that as well. I think that's encouraged.
And we're 3 Canadians, so we're going to apologize a lot. That's what we do. My first apology is a lot of the rules and a lot of the analysis we're doing today is Canadian-based. So we... oh, that's good. All right. Got our crew in the house. So just be mindful that the practices and procedures and jurisdiction in your area may be different than our case scenarios, especially when we get into some of the analysis that Jason does in terms of what you can add back into somebody's income for purpose of care for support, for example. In Canada, we can write off a lot of business expenses, so we use line 150 of our tax return just as that's the reported income. But there's a whole bunch of other income that can come back in. So this is that's sort of a very Canadian context, and it's probably similar in your jurisdictions as well here in the U.S.
So why collaborative thrives? You guys already know this. One of the wonderful things about collaborative is that it takes that adversarial bit away from the court. So we're going to get away from it. We can actually drill down to what's really mattering to this family and to their business. We're not worrying about a judge just imposing what he wants to do, a fire sale or anything like that. So that's one of the wonderful things. We know that both parties are coming in voluntarily, so we're assuming then that they're going to want to talk about this business and be creative in how we're going to approach. And then also, obviously, we're going to generate options. And some of our options have been incredibly creative, things that the clients never thought was possible, which was wonderful, and they're so happy now, which is the even better part of all of this.
Right.
Does anybody have a copy of the slides in front of them at the table? Some do. So if there's a problem, if you don't have the slides, and if there's a problem with seeing what's on the board because of the light, I don't know if we'll be able to get someone to dim the light. Absolutely, but just for purposes of today, let us know if you can't read something up there. I just want to
If you go to your online form, the slides are included with the information we submitted.
You'll be able to get them.
Yeah, and you can email us and we'll email you the PPT as well if you want a separate copy.
So this is just by way of reminder. In the collaborative context, what are some of the key elements? So I think we all know this, but the process is about voluntarily sharing full and frank financial disclosure and all disclosure. The spouses must remain willing and open to discuss the issues on the foundation of financial disclosure, okay? So it's really about open, honest, and full disclosure. And settlement will be based ultimately on the assumption that parties have acted in good faith and did provide full disclosure, okay?
So how can we save the golden goose, the why, right? We're going to give you 4 or 5 case examples of how it's worked for us. Your experience may be different. The cases we're talking about, these are real families with small businesses, and they're real cases, so we're not going to say our client's name or anything or what jurisdiction, but that's sort of what led us to create this paper about the golden goose. And we thought this is a really good area to specialize in. There's a real need for this service in the community, and we need to get the word out and educate our clients that this is an option that's open to them.
But before we get to the case studies, which will be great illustrations and examples, real-life situations, we just want to give some context and have a bit of a reminder about some of the concepts. So in the context of a family business, what does collaborative offer? Privacy, okay? The ability for tax planning and being creative with potentially corporate structures and what you can do to structure things going forward. Flexible payment structure, okay? Flexibility and structuring a settlement, right? You don't want a situation where perhaps the equalization payment or support requirements going forward will put the business at risk or sacrifice the business, because then you sacrifice the income source. So ultimately, it allows for increased corporate health, protecting income and capital. Okay.
So the next thing we want to do is we want to ensure the following. We want to ensure that insurance is in place. So we're going to cushion any risks through insurance processes, which is a great thing to do, something you can't get in court. We want to do succession planning. A lot of these companies, they have children that want to be coming in, or their children have spouses, and we need to plan for that succession and how the parents, if they're going to co-own the property or the business, how they're going to continue to go forward with that. We want to do the income streams. Sometimes we have a party that says, I don't want anything to do with the business, but I'll stay on as a director because it's better for the overall structure. So we want to look at how do we continue those income streams. Income splitting. In some areas, you can still income split with a family business, so children may be a part of that income splitting. If and when scenarios, it may not be a viable option to sell the business right away, so we want to be able to plan, well, if this happens, then we'll sell it, and then this will happen. So we want to look at those things. And also acknowledging the market. You know, there are better times to sell certain types of business, and so we want to be mindful of all of these things when we're looking at these kind of businesses.
One of the great things about the collaborative process is that it allows for option generation, considering different options, maybe outside of the traditional legal framework. And that's one of the things that Russ and Carrie are fantastic with. I've been involved in a couple situations with Russell and Carrie going through the collaborative process, and I see their ability to generate options for the clients. And not just limiting options. It's like, let's get everything out there on the table. Even if you think it's ridiculous, let's put it out there so that we're recognizing that this is a potential option. Even if it doesn't meet our interests or our needs or our goals, we want to put them all out there so that we can see what the options are, and then we can start to have a dialogue about those options. So in the context of a family business or businesses, what are, some of the alternative options? Well, are there family trusts or holding companies in place now? And we're going to talk about the importance of understanding corporate structure and ownership. That's very critical when you have a family business or businesses, to understand that. Are there trusts and holding companies in place? Or would it be useful to have those in place going forward, right? So we want to talk about options. Tax planning. Avoiding audits from the tax authorities. Okay, there's There may be things you can do from a tax planning perspective. Employment of spouse and children. Are any family members involved in the business? Have they historically been involved? In what capacity? Do they want to continue to be involved in the business or not? Something to consider, something to look at. And then, as was mentioned earlier, just general estate succession planning, right? All business owners should be thinking about this and addressing this, but it's a topic that needs to come up throughout this process as well when there's business.
So this slide is titled Our Roles, but it's really your roles as well. I had a case recently, last few weeks, looked fairly straightforward, no children, young couple. The lawyer on the other side I'd worked with collaboratively. We phone each other up and we think, well, this is pretty easy. We could probably just do it, the two of us. But my preference now is to start with a full team all the time. And if we need to drop a family professional or a financial professional, we'll do that, but we've never dropped the neutral because they're so effective. So he reluctantly agreed, and it was sort of that iceberg analogy, right? We saw the tip out of the water. Everything was hunky-dory, and then the family professional reports in terms of the dynamics of the relationship, and there's a whole nother side of this family that we didn't see, or we weren't asking questions about as lawyers. What I like to do, and I think these guys would agree, we always start with a full team. It would have been great to have a family professional speaking with us here today. We were limited to 3 speakers, but what the family professional would add would be all the other non-legal dynamics that go into a family business. And we're going to talk about that in terms of the case studies that we do. So the other nice part about having a full team, it levels the playing field. So let's just say, for example, one spouse wasn't involved in the business. They feel scared and nervous, and they don't have any information, and the information they do get, they don't understand. So if you have a full team, you can slow that part down, work with them off-site, explain the information in a meeting that may last 3 or 4 hours because we're educating them as well. Where if it was just the 2 lawyers in a collaborative setting, the person may be too nervous or scared to ask those questions. Usually when the full team gets together, there's a certain pace to the meeting that the lawyers sometimes dictate. So by having the full team, you can really address all the power imbalances that are going on behind the scenes that we may not know about, or the family dynamics or relationship issues with adult children, for example. You get this Greek chorus in the background that sometimes we don't know is going on, and they report back to the professionals. So it really makes our team, our experience a lot more effective when we have everybody involved. The other thing I really stress is have a team where you have a lot of trust in the other professionals, and knowing that they're going to have your back and they're going to report to you things that may be difficult for your client, and they may tell a family professional something that they wouldn't tell their lawyer. And it just helps us understand the case better when we're considering family businesses and what are the dynamics and what the outcome's going to look like and what would or would not work. Could there be some legacy planning? Can we hold the business and do an if and when payment down the road? Or does somebody need a clean break right away for some other reason? So that's sort of what we do in our roles. We try to always use a full team.
Yes, and it works great. So I am a financial professional, like some of you out there are. One of the best things that we have is the power of neutrality. We have both clients telling us all sorts of great information, and they don't always share that with our family professional. They don't always share that with their legal counsel, but that's the other nice thing about team is we kind of triangulate on information. But we are neutral. We stay neutral, which is a fabulous thing. It's a great thing because what ends up happening is with our client and advisory role, we always have one client that doesn't quite know as much as the other. So either they're not involved in the business as much, they don't know anything about the household spending. So our role is, a lot of it is educating. And we're also educating our legal counsel and the other members of the team, letting them know that, hey, did you know that this is an issue? There is a financial problem that we're having right now. So it's a great part for us. We're financial disclosure experts. I don't know about the other financials in the room, but we have an ability to get information that they just don't give anybody else. I think part of that is knowing that what our specific role is and that we're not doing a broadcast of the information. I think that's a big part of it. We are an early warning sign for the entire team. The one thing that's nice about our role is we will tell them, the entire team, about any financial inequalities that there might be happening. So somebody has full control over a bank account and they've decided, well, it was joint, but I put all the money in, I run the business, I'm cutting her off or him off. And so we're a really good advisory board to letting everybody know so that we can get on those early problems and issues and resolve them so that we can keep the process moving positively. We do the disclosure preparation. We're doing all the analysis and presentation. I think every jurisdiction does it a little bit differently, but you know, there's always that set way that people like to do it. At our firm, we have developed a way that we like to do it. We like to call it the Bible. So we give a full financial brief, and it has all of the disclosure in it, all tax returns, everything. It is a one-stop shop for legal counsel, so they don't have to go and dig through it. We're managing expectations of our clients, which is something the entire team does. We get those clients that sit there and tell us, I have to have, I need X number, and it's about bringing it down into reality. Sometimes it's about reverse budgeting. Instead of somebody saying, I need $10,000 a month, or it's, I'm gonna be living in a box on the street, it's like, well, let's take that down a notch and let's see, what do you need? What are your monthly costs? What is happening? And so that we can find something that's comfortable for everyone in the family. We're gonna do continuous financial analysis and options as we go through. So one of our roles is that we're gonna help develop with the team these great options for the family. And like Jason said earlier, we may have, you know, the craziest options up on the table, but sometimes it's cherry picking. It's like, I like what's part of that option, but I really like what's part of this option. And so we're kind of tracking that and making sure we're going through those options. We're gonna keep the documents and report preparation. And the next chapter, we're gonna help them with their new operating model. So what does that mean for them? How does that new budget look? Is this going to work? Can we stress test it early in the process to make sure that whatever we've decided and how we're gonna go forward actually works for both parties? It's never about one party. It's always, for us, it's always about both parties and what we can do to make life better for them. Like was said earlier, probably the biggest part of this is we're maintaining privacy. It's huge for our clients. As many of you know, if you're going into the court process, your documentation is there for everyone to see, and it's a great way to do identity theft. It's also a great way for your business competitors to go in and find out all the problems with your business. So it's already been registered with the court. I go in and I say, gee, you know what? They're my competitor. I think I want all this stuff. As long as I have a Visa card, I can go and get all the documentation. I can find out what my competitors' financial statements are for the last 3 years. I can see what their tax returns look like. I can see everything. So going and having family businesses in the collaborative process is huge to maintain that privacy and that competitive edge. We want to preserve the wealth. This is never about decimating wealth for the privilege of one person. We want to preserve it. We want them to continually look at this as this is your family. Your family just looks a little bit different right now, but it is still your family, and this business needs to survive in order for everybody to survive. We want to be creative. We have never been able to do the same approach twice, and that, which is a wonderful thing. We can cherry pick from other things that we've done in the past, but for the most part, every single family business that we have touched has had a different approach and has had a different result, and it is very specific and very tailor-made to your clients, and that's a big thing for them, is knowing that they are unique, that we're not just slapping something that we've done a million times before on them. We want to pacify other stakeholders. Sometimes what we have is we have other partners that are not a part of the family dispute. So how do we make sure they're okay in this as well? They're a big part of it, and they can cause problems along the way. Sideline, we did have a partner that wanted to actually sit in on our collaborative meetings because he thought he should be there. We said no.
My client didn't like the idea.
Yeah, it was a bad idea. Tax planning, it's huge. We want to make sure we're still doing that tax planning. How is the company structured now? I don't know about you guys, but I like giving the CRA, which is Canada Revenue Agency, or in the case of Americans, the IRS, as least money as possible. I like keeping it kind of
in everybody's pockets rather than going out on taxes. So we want to do tax planning. We want appropriate allocation of risks and rewards. We don't want to take risk where they are unnecessary. And that if we can plan and if it means that we push something out by a year because it makes more strategic sense for the business, we want to look at that and make sure that we can find a way that it's palatable to everyone. And we're going to increase the options for settlement. So again, it's that idea that we may say, you know what, we can do this, but it may be a year out. We may have to move different assets around, but we want to have all of those options for settlement in there. And then we want to always maintain those goals and interests of our clients. And they're always a little bit different. And sometimes somebody will say, this is my goal, this is my interest, and we'll be going through, and as you all know, it can change over time as they get more information. People with good information make good decisions. So, but we always want to focus on that goals and interests.
All right, so things to consider. This ties in neatly with question number 3, what do I have to pay attention to at the first meeting? So this is where I find the family professional is so valuable. They give you the barometer and the temperature of the family, and they'll just tell you what the red flags are right off the bat. Sometimes some meetings even have to be shuttled because the emotions are running so high. You may want to start thinking about what the structure of this agreement may start looking like. The duration of the agreement, is this something that's going to be a clean break, or are we going to do some legacy planning? We'll also, after the first meeting, we'll get a flavor in terms of what other professionals, in addition to the full team, are we going to need to bring in. So we have, on a number of times, brought in corporate lawyers to help us with the share structures, and they give us the specific language according to the Business Corporations Act or whatever statute you operate under that we need to put into our separation agreement. Most family lawyers don't think about shotgun clauses and how we're going to wind up a business. So the corporate lawyer will give you the tools and a precedent that we can add into your agreement. So that's sort of an early warning thing, a question, you know, am I going to need to bring a corporate lawyer in? And we have a few that we work with, and we'll check their schedules and see if they're going to be available. Same with will and power of attorney. Sometimes the corporate lawyer will do that. Sometimes that would be a different lawyer. So if you're doing legacy planning and this business is going to continue and you own an interest in this business, you're going to want to make sure that the will and power of attorneys are consistent with what you've agreed to in your separation agreement. Again, some lawyers do it all. I just do the family law side of it, so I know enough to know that I'm going to get that part wrong. So we bring experts in to help us with that. So those are the main things I'd consider at the beginning. And so as soon as you meet your client, start thinking about the duration, what this agreement's going to look like. Are we going to need to draw on other team members to get it to the finish line? Right.
You know, small business, and how inside the collaborative are you able to maybe make a difference?
One of our case studies touches just on that question. I'll just jump ahead to it a little bit. This is a situation where my client was a teacher, and her husband had accused her of assault, so she was arrested in a small community. And it was in court, and she was trying to get her kids back. And the criminal trial had already occurred, and charges were dismissed. So this is what I walked into. Very little trust, a lot of anger. We pulled it out of the court system. We agreed on a custody order in the court system, but there's still a lot of other property issues we're going to talk about. And we agreed to pull it out of the court system to deal with the business issues collaboratively. And the family professional was essential in that, because my client didn't believe anything husband had to say. He's hiding everything, he's writing everything off. There was zero trust. So the family professional helped us manage those emotions, and then the financial professional gave the data credibility. This was a neutral, this was somebody working with both parties, and they didn't have a dog in the fight, so to speak. They're just presenting the data to the team. So that's sort of how we got over that emotional piece, but we're going to talk about that case study in more detail. It's a great question.
Yeah, that's a very, very real and important issue with these separations when a business is involved, and that's what we're trying to minimize through the collaborative process.
Right.
And it may come at you. Maybe the business owner will bring it to your attention. Maybe one of the partners will bring it to your attention. Mm-hmm. Maybe you'll see the dynamics. You'll see that the business is at risk given the situation. But I think that the collaborative process will give you the best chance of dealing with that issue and ensuring the survival of the business. And the collaborative process with the family professional like Russell was talking about, that sometimes that's very helpful too. But
Right.
that is the thrust of what we're trying to avoid,
Right.
right?
Your financial professional being that neutral is huge. I always kind of sometimes look at myself as a bit of a grim reaper because I'm always the bearer of bad news. It's like, well, no, he really didn't do all of the horrible things. No, he's really not hiding money. No, she didn't go and spend it all on something. I always feel like I'm the bearer of bad news, but because it is coming from the neutral person, it is far more palatable. We do tell our clients, at least in my office, that please do not give your spouse outside a process their options. Don't like tell them how it's going to be or what they need to do or anything like that. Let us do our jobs. And we find that getting them to actually agree to those communication guidelines to be used not only in the process but outside the process really helps, so that when we have to give information that says, no, this is not happening, these are the facts, it's far more acceptable.
Great question. Anybody else? If you want to
Any other
stop?
thoughts, any comments?
Okay, let's go to the next slide then.
So we've talked about the roles of some of the different parties in the collaborative process, the lawyer, the family, the financial professional. And Carrie talked a lot about the financial professional and the importance of the financial professional and the neutrality of the financial professional. Well, the business valuator is a financial professional as well, just a very, very specialized, brings very specialized expertise to the table, right? But I think it's important to also remember that the business valuation professional is neutral as well. Independent, unbiased, objective, neutral. And I think if you have a situation with clients that have a family business or businesses and you need to get a business valuation professional involved to help you, I think my main message to you today is to make sure that not only is your business valuation professional collaboratively trained, right? So can step into the situation maybe partway through the process, but not miss a beat, understands the dynamics and what's going on, knows their place. But they're also flexible and accommodating to the specific dynamics of the situation, right? So what do I mean? What does the business valuator bring to the table? What potential role does the business valuator involve? So a lot of what I do is, the first point up there, it's educating the clients on the process. I'm asked a lot about, you know, what I do, the process of doing evaluation, the process of quantifying or calculating one's income when there's a business involved. What is involved? What should I expect? What are you going to be doing? Are you going to be speaking to both parties? It's educating clients about this process. And then it's a matter of, within their toolkit of things that they can bring to the table, what's recognizing what's relevant or important to this situation. Is a written report needed? A written report valuing the businesses, providing a conclusion of value of the businesses. Or maybe the clients and the parties are happy to have a verbal report. That's another option. Okay, to speed up the process, to make it more cost effective, maybe we can do all our work, we do the same amount of work, we go through the same process, but rather than spending time papering up a written report, which sometimes is very detailed because it has to be in accordance with our professional standards, our governing body, you can save the time on writing up that report if a report isn't needed, and just go to a group team meeting and present and ask and answer questions. Okay, and that's an oral report. Yes, we've got a couple questions. Great. Go ahead.
So at times does the team agree, the team and the clients agree that we'll start with an oral report, and then if need be, you'll follow up with all the work to put it in writing?
Absolutely. Yes, that's an option.
How often do you end up doing, how often once you've done the oral report, does the request to
Right.
have it in writing actually occur?
Most of the time. Yeah. Most of the time I find the professionals want sort of documentation to paper their files. They want it in writing.
The value of a written report is you can attach it to the separation agreement, so whoever reviews it 5-6 years down the road will know exactly the data we were working with. And so you're sort of papering the file, like Jason said.
But there are times when it's a simpler situation, one business, it's not that complex, and both parties have an appreciation for the issues, and they're happy with just verbally meeting, and they can take notes. I will distribute schedules. We'll talk about assumptions. We'll talk about process. We'll talk about approach and findings. They'll take notes. They're just not getting a written report.
Right.
I don't understand why it would be looked at 5 or 6 years down and why they would need to come back to the valuation
Right.
of what the business was 5 to 6 years prior.
Let's say, for example, 5 or 6 years later, it's more of the lawyer covering their side of the agreement. 5 or 6.
I don't like that. It's not about.
No, but in terms of if somebody wants to set aside the agreement at a later date for some reason that we can't predict or anticipate, and we have a dispute resolution mechanism where they agree to go back to the collaborative process.
Yes.
So if that goes off the rails and it ends up in court at some point in time, the agreement's going to set in an exact detail all the data we had, all the choices people made. It's really a bulletproof the agreement in terms of having somebody complain later, well, I didn't know the value of the company was X, or they didn't close these dividends or these assets in the company when I first received the verbal report. So if you have a written report that sets out everything in detail in all the schedules, it can go later on in 4 or 5 years down the road if somebody says, well, I didn't know that asset existed. Go back to the report and it'll be on the schedule.
Boilerplate in there says that they're satisfied with all the disclosure.
You can do that too. I like to include more than less in the agreements. Yeah, back.
The other thing that I often see is that, like if you're starting and everybody's curious, you need to know the value of the business, but by the time you paper something, it can be 2 years later and it's changed. And so do you find that, like from a oral presentation that you're getting the information out there, but when things can change, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
You haven't gone through the options, so it's not that you're wasting time because you're not, but I think maybe it would allow the process to continue to flow without getting sort of stuck on
Right.
numbers.
You got to go back to goals and interests, right? What do your clients want? What are their interests? And some people want more data, and some people are good with a verbal report. They want closure. They want to move on. So every family is unique that way.
I guess that could be an issue if there's joint ownership, and it's important to sort of know the current value of the business, right? If there's not that, and you've sort of crystallized the date as the separation date of value, then no matter how much time has gone by, it theoretically shouldn't affect the value at that point in time. But you're right in
But for
situations
joint-
when
we've
I
dealt.
can't imagine how you would deal with that though, in terms of separation date crystallization, but they're still joint owners of a company.
Yeah.
The way we've dealt with it in one case is you develop a formula that everybody agrees to. So if we need to value it down the road, say there's going to be a sale of somebody's interest to the other party 3 years down the road, Jason would update his report. We've already agreed on the formula and the assumptions, and he would plug the data in. And that business may have grown or shrunk depending on what's happened in the business.
by that time it's a much easier and efficient process to come up with the value. Yeah.
Sorry, did you have a question over here?
I had a question in terms of, do you give a range or do you give a hard number?
Yeah, being a business valuation professional, recognizing that valuation is somewhat judgmental, we do always present a range. Our conclusion is expressed as a range of value, a low to high. It won't be too wide of a range, but it'll be a range, recognizing one way or the other. But
And the range, that when you do your high and low, you do it by weighting the different valuation methods?
sometimes it'll be based on different valuation methods, but more times than not, we will select the appropriate primary valuation approach, and maybe we'll vary a couple of the assumptions within that approach. For example, the cap rate or the valuation multiplier. It might be a because multipliers, when you're talking about valuation, it's very subjective, it's very risk-oriented, assessing the risk associated with the business, and you may oftentimes express the multiplier as a range of 5 to 6 times, so that will create a range.
And we did have one case where there was a huge range because there were certain assumptions we weren't sure of. We weren't sure who owned this business on the date of marriage. If it was one client's father, then that would be one issue, right? And then if it was the client, then there potentially a date of marriage deduction. So that particular case had a gigantic range that we had to try and narrow the gap collaboratively to come up with a solution that enabled the business to continue forward. And that's one of the case studies we're going to be talking about.
Okay, so we talked about written reports, oral reports. Sometimes I have another point up there being a big picture review. Is there likely value? So this is a very sort of specific situation, but it's happened a number of times where there's a small business, right? It may be just the owner involved in running the business. And the owner may rightfully so understand and appreciate that there's not much commercial value to this business. They've just essentially created a job for themselves. But the other spouse who's not active in the business has a different perception. They think they're running this business, getting all these benefits from this business. They could sell this business and it could be worth a lot. So there's that sort of difference there. It's a small business. It may not necessarily require a full valuation analysis, a full report. But you want someone like me to come in with valuation expertise to ask some key questions, to get some key documents, and then report back to the team as to whether or not I think, in fact, this is a situation where there's probably no commercial value. It's really dependent on the owner, personal goodwill. You're likely not going to see value above the book value. And there's value to that because that gives the other spouse peace of mind. So that's why I call it a big picture review. Yes?
Can you give some examples of what that would look like so that people are evaluating whether they should bring in somebody for that purpose or?
Sure. So I mean, as a guideline, I would say anytime you have a client with a business that is less than $1 million in annual revenue and not many, if not no, other employees, right? So look at the size of the business, look at the nature of the business. If it's service-oriented and the owner is providing that service and involved with all of the client or customer assignments, projects, it's small, there's no other employees. The clients are coming to the business because of the owner. Generally, those are situations where there's likely not commercial goodwill. Okay, so sometimes we're asked to investigate and report on perhaps a specific issue. Maybe there's claims or allegations of personal expenses being put through the business. They want us to investigate unreported cash sales. We'd have a whole workshop on unreported cash sales. We don't have time to do that, but there's a lot involved in dealing with that, and that's very common for some businesses. And sometimes you may utilize your business valuation professional to attend a team meeting with that option generation. So those are some of the key roles of a business evaluator.
You've had reports where you've included, spoke with the other spouse, and you included numbers for cash that we knew historically were coming in during the course of the marriage. And that was included in a report that was presented.
Which is great, that's when privacy helps.
Well, and the tax man, right? So you go to court, you're going to have different consequences.
And it's pretty common. It's not uncommon. Yeah.
Especially in smaller communities. Yeah.
So some of the benefits of a private settlement, first of all, the family business is a major source of funds and lifestyles for the family. The idea here is that we know small businesses put a lot of personal things through their company, vehicles, insurance, all of those sorts of things. We want to be looking at that, and that is something that those little extras, we want to make sure if we're not catching it, that Jason can catch it. The other thing we want to look at, especially when we're looking at a family business, is it what type of business structure is it? Is it actually a corporate structure? Is it a sole proprietor in which they don't actually have a corporate structure and they're just running all of their income through the regular tax returns? It makes a difference. So we don't want to destroy lifestyle. One of the things I like to say to our clients is if you are doing it as a sole proprietor, we want you to have your tax obligations as low as possible, but please understand that does not mean that those are the numbers we're going to be using when we're looking at things like support. We're going to add income back, so when you run your cell phone through, we know you're not just using it for business, we know it's also personal, your vehicle, home cable. You know, the boat you just bought, those sorts of things. We want to make sure that we're looking at those things as well. We know that tradition, yeah.
So you're actually reducing the print and incorporating in your process marginal tax practices of the people.
Well,
I mean, how do you manage that?
no, there are legal tax practices. So you're in Canada. There's a lot of things you're allowed to deduct if you're a sole proprietor. But and it's all on their income tax returns, so we can see all of it listed. And we go back through and say, all right, your vehicle. If you're a real estate agent and running as a sole proprietor, we're going to look at your vehicle differently than if you're somebody that is simply sitting at home every single day and you actually don't have to leave your home to perform your business. You have a home business. So you're writing off your entire vehicle, but you never go and see clients. You never have anywhere to go. For me, I'm like, no, that's an automatic add back. That automatically comes back to you.
This adds a lot of credibility for the spouse who's usually complaining about the lifestyle and the expenses that are being run through the business. If somebody like Jason or Carrie come to a meeting with a schedule of all the items they've complained about and added those back in for purpose of calculating support, they feel like they've been heard and they feel a lot better about the outcome.
Explain more as to the automatic add back in. So when you have this whole grocery list, and so one spouse is saying, look at all these expenses, and the other one is saying, well, they're legitimate tax expenses. So then is there a conversation as to what should be added in, they just say, oh, Carrie decided, so that's what
No,
it should be?
the lawyers would probably provide a legal framework
Okay.
and say if you were before a family court judge, a judge would look at the return and add these back into your income for purposes of determining child support. And that's quite common. So providing the legal framework and information to the clients would assist the financial neutrals to say, okay, here's what we're going to do in terms of add backs.
There are a couple things on a tax return that automatically go back. So for example, a capital cost allowance, it's a gimme. It's one of those things where the government just says, okay, you have a vehicle that's depreciated or you have machinery that's depreciated, we're going to give you a capital cost allowance for that. They actually, it's one of those things where it didn't actually cost them anything. It's just something that is a write-off that's allowable. That always automatically goes back. But there are other things that we do have those discussions about. Are these legitimate for the business, or is a portion of it legitimate for the business? So another big one is your home business write-off. So we have a home business write-off coming in, which is great, and we're saying absolutely, we want that on your tax return because you're paying less to the government, which means there's more money for the family as a whole. But then we want to look at it and say, well, wait a second, that bedroom you're using as your home office, if you didn't and you worked for somebody else, you still have to pay for that room. So we tend to add that back in as part of their income because they have to pay for it anyways.
And we do have a case study where we talk about the benefits would continue to be shared equally after the agreement is made,
Right.
because they continue to own the company jointly. So
But they also then need to have it explained to them that they should not complain too loudly,
Well,
because there is
as-
that tax
that goes back to
fraud.
the privacy and keeping it within the full team. That's
You-
right.
You also have to remember, when people are complaining or saying, you know, they're writing off all of these things, a lot of that is about fear. It's not necessarily about, I'm going to get you. It's that fear factor of, you know, he's already always run my car insurance through the company. My cell phone has always been paid through the company. How am I going to pay for that if either I don't have enough money or support isn't there? If I'm still a co-owner, do I still have that option to do that? So we really always have to be mindful of whether are we talking about somebody that is just complaining or pointing fingers, or are we talking about somebody that is talking out of fear of what they may be losing? So and that's again where our family professional is huge for us, because they're really hitting those triggers for us, saying, hey, they're really concerned about these following things. We want to make sure we're addressing those. And so we'll make that as a big point. We want to talk about the benefits of this company to everyone. So it's a big part of it there. Moving along, we want to make sure that the family resources are not depleted. That's a big part. We don't all of a sudden want somebody going, well, too bad for you. I'm a sole proprietor, I'm taking you off of the joint account and you can't have anything. We want to make sure as a team and when we're all talking that we're not depleting the resources. We want to make sure that if they are paying for process, because that's a huge deal for a lot of these people, how do we do it? Great, you have a joint line of credit. Your joint line of credit will only be used for this process, and you will report back to me every month. You will send me the monthly statement so I can see what's going on with that account. We make them accountable to make sure that those resources are not being depleted. A lot of reporting goes back to Jason if he's doing a business valuation, especially if we know there's changes in the marketplace. We want to know, hey, they lost that big contract. That's why resources are depleted right now. It's not because somebody's been frivolously spending or doing something untoward. So we always want to make sure Jason's always in that loop. And then of course there's the family business can be put at risk from lack of effort. It's like, well, I'm not going to work because I don't want to share any more of this with you. You know, and my job has been a lot of times saying to people going, you understand by doing this, you're hurting yourself. You're not hurting your spouse, you're hurting yourself and you're hurting your children. Please continue to work as you have always done. If you are worried about things that need to be adjusted, we will absolutely be doing a statement of adjustments to ensure that everything is working out equitably to everybody and that it's acceptable to everyone. So we want to make sure of that. We don't ever want to see a forced sale or liquidation of a company that's unnecessary. We don't want somebody standing there stamping their feet going, nope, I want it sold, I want my money. You're never ever going to get a great result doing that. So we want to make sure we're watching for that. And also the public record, and we spoke about this earlier, that in Canada, if you're going through court, all this information is going on public record and is obtainable.
Not in Alberta anymore.
No, oh really? Wow.
So we have to do authorities to access to allow anybody to get the public on file. So if
That's
I want my partner
amazing.
to get something, I have to draft up an authority act. Like it's a pain for me, but that way nobody can access it.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Because in Ontario, it's still free and open access. So things we want to consider, the collaborative process can work even in high conflict matters. We're actually having a lot of success with high conflict. It almost seems like the higher the conflict, the better results we're getting, because we're really getting people to be heard. And that's probably our biggest thing with high conflict, is that ability to be heard. Wife now feels that she has a voice if she hasn't been a part of the business, or husband feels the same way, but they're finally having somebody that's listening to them. It's not just one person. They have their wonderful advocate of their legal counsel, but they have neutrals that are also listening. When it comes to the business, whoever's in the business can tell Jason everything he needs to know. And even that person that's not involved can tell Jason, here are all my concerns about what's been going on. Can you answer these questions? And sometimes they're great questions, and Jason's been able to provide information that calms everything right down.
So that could be a shareholder of the company that's not part of the family. We can give Jason permission to consult with the shareholder as well.
Yeah. And that's why knowing our corporate structure is huge. We absolutely need to know what type. Are we talking about a sole proprietor and it's only one person? Are we talking about a partnership? Are we talking about a corporation? We really need to know this from the start. What are we dealing with? So one of the questions is what you should know beforehand. Like on that very first meeting, knowing that corporate structure should be one of the very first things you should always know. And that don't let it go until you're in your third or fourth meeting and go, oh, by the way, what kind of company is this? How are you situated? We want to know the shareholder arrangements with that. So getting minute books, getting that kind of information again. As soon as we know the structure, we want to get the next set of documentations right away. It's also great as you're financial neutral. You want to get all of that information because it's super easy for me to get it organized and send it to our business valuator so that they're not doing a hunting job. They can figure out, oh great, I have all of this, I just need. Jason will usually come to us first and say, hey, do you have? And then if we don't have it, he can go directly to the client. So it keeps things flowing and it helps the clients.
Help manages the expense too.
Absolutely, and that's huge, is managing that expense. And then we want to know, are there any trusts or holding companies? Some people say, I have a company, and then you find out that there's a holding company over here, and then there's a family trust over there, and there's some other little company that they just started over here, and they tell you it's all for tax reasons. So we want to know what else, what is tied to it, what all comes as a part of it. Okay.
We can't overemphasize that enough. If you're going to take anything away from this session today about what to pay attention to at the first meeting, is understand the companies involved, the share ownership, who the players are, who the owners are, what the dynamics are, who's involved from the family, what the corporate structure is, are there trusts, are there holding companies? That is so important. You will need to know that information throughout the whole process.
Just touch on retained earnings.
Okay, so here we're talking about a situation where we're doing an income assessment, determining the income of a business owner, right? And there are some common adjustments that have to be made when looking at a business owner's reported income to the tax authority versus what is their real income when you're talking about gross and equivalent to an employee, right? Because business owners can derive benefits from their business. Unreported cash, personal expenses, they could pay themselves dividends, which may be taxed more favorably, which have to be adjusted. But a big one is whether or not to attribute pre-tax corporate income to the owner as additional income available to them for support purposes, right? So the courts in Canada or in Ontario look at this issue and say, an adjustment may or may not be appropriate. So we're going to have to look at the facts of the situation. And they typically look at 4 factors or considerations. And I look at that as well when I do my income assessments for business owners. It's what is the nature of the business? 1. Is this, for example, is this a business that is highly capital intensive and requires a lot of capital reinvestment in the business? Because if that's the case, then maybe not all of the income is available for distribution because some of it has to be reinvested in the business. Or is this a largely service-based business? I see doctors out there with medical professional corporations and they distribute all the income at the end of the year because they don't have to reinvest in the business. So the nature of the business. Another factor is just the ability to control. So what is the actual ownership interest? Do they have a controlling interest? Do they own more than 50% of the business? If they own more than 50%, they have the ability to control that decision to distribute income by way of dividend. If they're a minority shareholder, then those decisions have to be made in conjunction with other shareholders. Okay? Another factor, consideration, is just what's the pattern here? What's the history? Is there a history of this owner actually distributing profits at the end of the year by way of dividend? If there's a history of it happening and now all of a sudden you've stopped, well, hey, we're going to take a look at that because you've shown that you've demonstrated that you've done it in the past, so maybe you could continue to do it.
Sometimes it stops after
Right.
somebody decides to separate. So
Right.
you have to say, all right,
Right.
are they loading up the company with cash so
Right.
they don't have to pay their spouse?
And finally, the 4th consideration is just the availability of income to distribute. Okay, so that's A, is there income? Because if the company had a bad year and there was a loss that year, obviously there's no income to attribute. But if there's income, you don't just automatically attribute 100% of it. You have to look at the ability of the company to distribute that income. So what we look at are things like retained earnings. Has there been an accumulation of income over the years such that there's a lot of retained earnings in the business? Well, if there is, then maybe you could distribute some of it. Is there cash available? So I look at the cash and working capital balances at the end of the year. And if there's sufficient cash and working capital on hand, then that's an argument for being able to distribute. Look, the income was available to distribute, you just chose to keep it in the business, right? Other things we look at are there any bank covenants, bank loan agreements? Are there any obligations or contractual sort of requirements for them to keep certain ratios, certain levels of cash on hand in the business? You have to consider that because they may not be able to distribute income if it depletes the company's resources and it puts them offside on covenants. So all of that speaks to the retained earnings and the ability to distribute funds from the business. It's not cut and dry. It's very difficult and it's very case by case. Okay.
All right, that's great, Jason. So case studies, these are all cases we have personally worked on these, and we have some information on your table in terms of the factual background. Again, the theme of all small business families and owners are privacy, flexibility, and security. Overall, their goals and interests usually reflect those 3 things. So you have a really unique opportunity to service this client base by focusing on collaborative practice. With respect to the first case study, this is the one I mentioned a little bit earlier, where this was the teacher that got arrested for an allegation of assault on her husband. So the husband had custody of the kids on a temporary basis, came to me while they're in court. We got that part resolved. He had a small automotive car dealership. Small in terms of compared to other dealerships, it was a big dealership because they lived in a small community. Lots of assets. They had a home that was paid for. I thought the best way to resolve this would be to do it collaboratively outside of the court system. That also enable us to put some closure to the custody side of the case. So we got a family professional involved, we got a financial professional involved, we eventually ended up getting Jason involved. Very hostile. My client was extremely angry, wanted to lash out at her husband, didn't trust him, didn't trust any of the data we were getting. So this is how we started our collaborative process. And it took 4 or 5 team meetings, but eventually we got to the point where we were able to come up with a result that was acceptable to everybody. As if I wasn't doing it collaboratively, I think the result could have been a lot worse for my client, because factually, her husband's father owned the company. It wasn't her husband. So that was an asset we thought that existed, but in court would be disallowed. But de facto, the husband ran the company and his father had retired. So there was an argument to say that the husband did own the company. So this is a great case that's going to cost his family $100,000 or $200,000 in legal fees over a 2-3 week trial, with dueling experts indicating what the value of this asset is. And the family's resources would have been depleted, and the company probably would have been sold or gone bankrupt. So that's sort of what we're walking into. So we were faced with the legal model, and when I was dealing with the custody issue, I thought this is great. Her husband has a car dealership. There's lots of assets to deal with. So if I simply approached it by way of a legal model, it would have undermined my client's interest, because I didn't fully understand the nature of the company at that time. We hadn't had disclosure. We didn't realize the father was still actively, well, on paper involved with the company. We ended up doing something very creative. This is also the case study where Jason's report came up with a big range, because these assumptions were different. So we're $400,000 or $500,000 apart, even on the range of an expert report. So lots of room for people to fight if they wanted to continue with the fight, but we were able to do it creatively. So you want to talk a little bit how we're managing client expectations in that?
Oh yeah, so client expectation, this was really one about, instead of depleting the cookie jar, that what we wanted to do was do a lot of building up. What do you really require? Is this a matter of, if we're looking at full incomes that were coming in, is it reasonable because he wasn't drawing out all of that money out of the company? There were other things that we had to take into consideration. So we really had to manage, especially with Russell's clients, her expectations. He was fairly easygoing in most of the process. So, but it was also making sure she understood that there was a time period in which he had full custody of their children. So that had to be an adjustment, and it was against her, that adjustment. But then we were adjusting for how future support would be handled, both for spousal and for child support. So kind of always mixing those things in and making sure that it was understood. There was a lot of hand-holding on her part, just so that she understood each step. She was the less sophisticated financially of the two of them, so we really wanted to make sure that she really understood what we were doing. And Russell was great in also supporting the fact that Jason's reports that came out showing that in one scenario she may not be entitled to anything, but we didn't also want to deplete him on the other side. So again, it was that giant range. And Jason can talk more about the giant range.
Way to go, Jason.
This was a tough one, and Carrie mentioned that he was reasonable. Ultimately, he was, but not initially. This was a tough one because this was a situation where legally, his father owned preferred shares in the business, and they had a high redemption value from some tax planning that had happened a number of years earlier. And ultimately, when you value the business, all that value got eaten up by the pref shares, which were owned by the father. There's no value left to the business to him. As far as he was concerned, that's the situation. So it took a couple of meetings with him to talk that through and to talk to him about what's really going on here. So it took a couple of meetings to uncover the fact that he ultimately entered into this, rather than buying his father out many years earlier, which is ultimately what happened. The father retired, he was running the business. He quote, is leasing the business from his father under this lease arrangement that he was going to continue to pay dividends to him over the years, but that enabled the father to have pref shares and take all the value. Well, really, he's getting the benefit from the business. There was personal expenses. That's another issue that we had to investigate, because the wife thought there was a lot of personal expenses being paid by the business. So we had to investigate that, and once we investigated that, talking to the accountant, looking at the general ledgers, we ultimately discovered and found out that, yeah, although the business was paying personal expenses, they were recording them in their shareholder loan account. So that's fair game. That's just a loan. That's not going through expenses. But that was another issue that had to be talked through. And it took a couple of meetings to get him to really see that ultimately he had the business and some value should be ascribed to him for that. Is that on the legal side of things, he has an asset that isn't worth anything, but creatively, realistically, ultimately, he does have an asset that's worth this. So we had to notionally look at a situation where, let's go back and say that rather than this lease arrangement you structured with your father, let's assume you bought the business. It was around $1 million, let's say. You bought the business. You wouldn't have been able to finance or pay cash at the time, so you would have had to take back a loan. So we had to notionally figure out what that loan amount would be to offset the value of the business if he had bought the business, right? So we had to creatively come up with a way that gave the realistic picture of the situation, but it was difficult.
And we ended up getting a result that both of them found was acceptable, right? Fairness is fairly subjective. What one person thinks is fair and somebody else thinks is fair is two different things. But it was a result that kept it out of court. We've kept the business running. We've kept a lot of the equity still in the family. The husband still owed the wife an equalization payment, which he had to pay. And she still was able to secure support going forward in the business at a fairly good level, because the business continued to thrive. So let's just jump through some other case examples here, because we got about 10 minutes left.
Yeah, no problem. So the next thing that we have is this family. This family was actually lovely. They were an older couple. We would consider them probably as a great divorce. They had grown children, but one of their major goals and interests for both of them is that the children are absolutely not involved. The children were shareholders at part of it. They also were insistent that we do not do a business valuation. This was a very complicated structure of multiple companies. There were offshore companies as well as the ones within Canada, and they said to us, we do not want to do business valuations. We do not want to trigger anything tax-wise. They did not want to trigger audits. They didn't want to trigger any additional taxes, but the wife wanted nothing to do with the businesses. So she was a owner on paper, but absolutely not active in the business whatsoever. We got to be super creative with this family, because one of the things that we did, and we talked about it earlier, is we did contact a corporate lawyer to help us work out their agreement.
Right.
Do you want to talk a bit more?
Right. So what we did here is she continued to own the business, and then in terms of legacy planning, she agreed to leave her interest to the children, and then there's provisions to wind up the company should one of them die, because basically a great business person was going to continue to operate the business, and she acknowledged that was his skill set. And then they continued to share the expenses. They considered to continue to do write-offs. And she received an equalization payment, not the full amount, but she'll get the second amount later. But the one part of her equalization was more than enough for her to buy $1 million home on the lake and continue with the lifestyle that she was used to. And what was important to her was getting a clean break from the business, so there was no liability associated with her, and that was all built in through the corporate lawyer, and also not bringing the children in. And so we were able to meet her goals, and I thought it was a great result.
It was a great result, and this was one of the ones where we ended up, there was not only a separation agreement, but they redid their wills to reflect and support the separation agreement along with the share structure that happened. So there were actually 3 agreements that happened within one. And they've gone on and been quite happy with everything that happened. So that was a really nice thing for
And
us.
the corporate lawyer was so excited, I think, to be part of this family setting and to do something very creative for a family that we've used him on other cases. So in terms of being responsive, he thinks this is great. You know, he hasn't seen approaches like this before, and we got really good feedback from the other professionals that were involved.
Do you ever have issues managing outside parties that come in?
Parties or lawyers or?
Lawyers or accountants that?
Well, that goes back to one of our opening comments. You got to trust your team, right? So.
Collaborative team, but like the accountants that may have worked for the family that, like, has that ever come?
Well, and yeah, if we think there's an issue or if we're certain about the data, we'll bring somebody like Jason in to investigate it and double check the numbers.
A lot of time we're not running into a huge problem with their corporate counsel or with their corporate accountants because the business owners are saying to them, I want you to cooperate.
Right.
I want you to give them this information. You have full authority to talk to them. So we don't get a lot of pushback. It might be a little slow getting us information, but we're not getting a ton of pushback.
And most of the time you're dealing with other professionals, so they are being professional. But
It's actually interesting because with this case study, they had an enormous estate home. It was spectacular. It would have made a fabulous resort, and it was up for sale.
Right.
And what we ended up doing is say he wanted to keep the home and sell it at some other point because it's one of those properties that are not easily sold. So what ended up happening is we settled on an amount, but then we did an if and when. If the value of the home is sold for over this within this time period, then he would increase what she received.
Right.
So we did do things like that within this agreement to make sure that they were covered off and nobody had that buyer's remorse feeling later.
I actually forgot about that. That's good. I feel better now. All right, let's go to the next case study.
case study 3. So it's 10:30, but so as quickly as we can.
Yeah.
This one sort of illustrates the importance of understanding the corporate structure and the ownership. This one we call the not so silent partner. So this is one where the family or the husband owned 75%. There was a third party shareholder as well, 25%. The husband's 75% was owned by a holding company, which was owned by both husband and wife. So there's some dynamics here. We were retained to do a business valuation. The company was established during the marriage, so the separation date valuation, and an income assessment. And the husband didn't want any part of this process. So the husband said to the minority shareholder, you know all the financial information, you know all the financial data, you deal with the business evaluator. You send them all the information, you deal with them. So I didn't even meet the husband until into the process. I was dealing with the third party shareholder. And he was very, very forthcoming, very open, very honest person, so I had no issues there. But ultimately it came to a team meeting situation, and the husband wanted the partner at the meeting. And that was not going to happen. But what else came up, another issue that came up in this process is I'm asking about personal expenses paid by the business. I'm dealing with the minority shareholder. He had to go and dig all this information up. And at the end of that process, he discovered that the husband was having the business pay more personal expenses over the last number of years than he was. So there's this dynamic going on as well. And then, after the separation date, the business came on a little bit of a hard times with the market, maybe lost a contract, market downturn. The minority shareholders thinking about potentially maybe buying some more interest in the business. But at the values that I'm coming up with, compared to today, with the negative impacts on the business, he's concerned that now I'm going to set some expectations on the value of the business that he may have to buy into. But so there's a lot of these types of issues going on. And it took a meeting with the husband to explain my process and my findings, and ultimately.
And there was a family cottage, and the kids wanted to continue to use the cottage, but this was an asset that needed to be liquidated to pay my client her equalization payment. So we had the Greek chorus of these adult children showing up at my client's home saying, why are you forcing us to sell the cottage? So they had that whole dynamic going on. And we ended up coming up with a fairly creative solution.
We did. Now, just to go back to the family expenses, the children were not happy at all in this process because they lost their gas cards, all of them. They were taken away at the end of the... So the children did not fare well in this. They were quite upset about that. But everybody else ended up feeling okay about it.
Yeah. And the final outcome?
And the last one.
Well, let's skip this one. and go to closing comments, because I know
Sure.
everybody wants to get to the next one. So just the last one, if anybody wants to talk a little bit about that one, you can certainly email me or phone me and we can talk about it, or Carrie or Jason. So all these families, had they not had this option of working collaboratively to save the business, would have likely gone to court with competing experts. And those experts probably would have been $10,000 to $20,000 each, and it would have been a 1 or 2 week trial. And as you can see, there was a lot of gray area. The judge may or may not agree with you, especially with the one with the auto dealership. So that would have been a huge risk to whoever ran that trial, and they probably would have spent $100,000 or $200,000 on legal fees. There probably would be an appeal of that decision, likely, because there'd be still enough money to fight about it, and somebody was going to be really upset with the outcome if we just applied the traditional legal model. And it would have been, the other thing that we need to consider, it would have been 2 or 3 years to get to that point, to get to a trial stage of litigation. That would be the time frame in Ontario. So we were able to avoid all that. We were able to save these businesses, or the golden goose. They continued operating in some fashion. These businesses continue to produce income and wealth for the families. And everybody found a result that was acceptable. And what was acceptable to one person and what's acceptable to another, maybe they agreed for the result for different reasons. For that last one, my client still has a relationship with her adult children. We were able to deal with the cottage in a way that kept the cottage in the family. And for the other one, they were able to continue to operate this business, which would have sold at a fire sale. So this is the benefit of using the full team, bringing in experts like Jason and Carrie and corporate counsel and estate planning counsel and tax lawyers to help your clients who own small businesses keep them thriving. So that would be my closing comment. Anything, Carrie?
No, I think that was great. I think just remember the power of the collaborative process and when we're always keeping those goals and interests forward, it's really easy for us to kind of always be driving for the C. We remind our clients, no matter what, even though you're in collaborative, you're still going to have moments of impasse. We've had a lot of them on all of those case studies that we did. But it was about always reminding them about what their goal was that always got them through that impasse, and finding out that no, everybody was going to be okay and everybody was going to be heard. It was a huge factor for all of them.
Jason?
Well, I think I don't have nothing further to add. They summed it up perfectly, and in the interest of time and letting you get on with your day.
Yeah. And then Jason can tell us all the...
Yeah.
All right, well, listen, thank you for coming out at 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning. I really appreciate it.